Hi, everyone. This is Brandon Levins, the sole brain behind the Project Port Authority. You are watching the first of probably many episodes where I go over the mix sessions for all the songs I end up releasing and just give you all the Coles notes and details on how sounds were made, how songs were arranged, all the mixing techniques, all that good stuff. This is episode 1 where we're talking about the song Inside Stranger, the first track off of Sessions Volume 1. Let's go.
All right, we are in the Pro Tools session for Inside Stranger, track 1. Those of you with a keen eye will look up at the top left over here where you have the file name and see that it, in fact, does not say Inside Stranger. Rather, it says The Spice of Life, M1-3. Explanation being that The Spice of Life was a working title that I had pretty well right at the start and then never bothered to change until just when I was registering the song and about to put it out. And I was thinking, oh god, I need an actual title that's like relevant to the song. What am I going to do? So we changed it. Inside Stranger it became. The rest is history. But all the files still say The Spice of Life because it was that late when I changed it. After that, the M1-3 is kind of just how I've organized files through all these projects. So everything has a prefix. So a prefix C is for composition or writing. E is for doing any kind of edits. And M is for mixing. So that means this is mix 1, or the first time going through and mixing this particular song. -3, so it's the third save as that I've done in the process of doing this mix. All right, so there's not a whole lot going on. It's a pretty standard, simple project and is nowhere near as complicated as what's going to be coming up. So it's a good place to start. Up here at the top, we have all of the heartbeat sounds, which are collectively being pumped into the Big Thump aux. Big Thump has an EQ, just to get rid of some extra highs that I don't want there, and then a Maxim. Maxim is a limiter. It comes free with Pro Tools. It doesn't sound amazing, but it does a really good job at making things loud. The closest equivalents are probably all the limiters you can get from Waves, like the Ultra Maximizer. But those cost money, and this is free. So, yay. All the heartbeat sounds. You've probably known what they sound like if you've heard the song, but for those who haven't, this is the main heartbeat. And it has a sub underneath it, which is an 808 kick. It's pretty subtle. If you have big speakers, you'll hear that. Under that, we have big heartbeats, which is used in sort of the coarse sections. It's doing the same kind of pattern, but it's a different sound, a little more high-end, a little more open, a bit more loose. And it has some panning going on, too. Right here. Yeah. And then at the end of the song, too, it also gets a sub, which is another kick drum that I've just layered underneath it. And that kick drum actually has a bit more attack than the 808 kick does. It's that, and you can hear some of the noise at the end there. You get quantization errors, so you'll hear when it gets really quiet, it sort of fizzles out rather than just goes quiet. A lot of things on here have some kind of bit crusher or sample rate reduction, whatever, on it, and you'll be seeing it a lot as we go through the projects. There's, I believe, a sound in this session a little later on that is using it actively, and I'll show you that when we get there. So underneath all of this, then we get background noise, which sounds like this. Really all that is it is a phase plant patch with white noise. There's a phaser stuck on there, and then there's also a filter which has a big steep notch filter that's moving up and down with an LFO. And then it's being pumped through a Grossbeat in FL Studio because Grossbeat is awesome. And that's the origin of that sound. Underneath that, we have the main drone, which sounds like this. That sound is originally an engine that I recorded on a ferry. So, for an explanation, where I live, you need to take ferries to get places because island. And when I was taking a ferry, I had a recorder with me and was just grabbing a bunch of sounds from wherever I could. And 2 of those sounds ended up appearing on here. The first of which is this drone, which is, again, a recording of the engine. And the second, underneath it, which is very appropriately named Ferry Sounds, is this. Very eerie, very nice. I like it. It is probably my favorite sound in this entire song. And what that is, okay, so on the ferries, there are 2 doors on either end which open and close when you're leaving and arriving at dock. And when they open and close, you get this beeping that goes on. So I recorded that, slowed it way down, threw it through a bunch of effects, and you get this really eerie sort of siren-like take. Or siren-like sound, I should say. And you'll also hear, if you listen to that again, that the background noise changes because I could have removed it. I could have gone into like RX or whatever and taken out background noise so it was a clean recording. But I thought that having the background noise there added an extra element. It added an extra layer underneath everything that just made it less static. So if I play it again, you'll hear, listen to the background, not the beeping, and you'll hear it actually change and move over time. Like right there. And all that is just left in to make it more interesting. Underneath that, we have shrill effects, which is this. It's all in the name. It's a shrill effect. I do believe the origin of that is it's a solid tone that had a kilohertz frequency shifter put on it, which I can pull up here so you can kind of see what it's doing. This is a mono track, so mono. Basically, it is exactly what it does, how much to shift frequencies by. So I use this with a randomized LFO running really, really fast so that it would just jump to random frequencies. And let's say if I just play it again and just muck around with the frequency shifter here, you'll hear actually what it's doing to the sound. So let's do this. Very cool. And now imagine doing that at like 50 times a second. That's that sound. So underneath that, we get into more of the sort of one-time sounds, or all the effects, so to say. First up here, there's the synth sweep. It's a synth that sweeps. It's not that much more complicated than that. On there, I have a real crunchy distortion, and then an EQ just to make it a little less nuts. That's going into the general reverb. We'll get to that when we talk about effects and auxes. Under that, echo effects sounds like this. So that is I made it a one-shot sample, but originally it was my voice. And I was just sort of making random noises into a microphone and then putting that through a ring modulator. And I had the internal frequency of that ring modulator set really, really high. And that means that any sound you put through that ends up taking on this like bell-like metallic quality. And you can put literally any audio source under the sun into a ring mod and do the same thing and you'll get something interesting. So that was my voice. I did the ring mod trick, I chopped it up, made it a one-shot sample, and sequenced it out wherever I wanted it. Under that, we have bird sample, which I'll tell you right now is not a bird, but it sounds like this. That is a ton of reverb, and I like it. The origin of that is, okay, old samplers, really, really old samplers. Let's go back to like the late 70s, early 80s. The Fairlight comes out, the first major digital sampler on the market. And it had a whole bunch of sounds installed in it just by default. And I don't actually know if it was a default sound, but it definitely arrived on one of the various versions, is a shakuhachi flute. And the source I have, or the samples I had that shakuhachi flute with all the articulations and trills and all the fancy stuff along with it. So this is that sound that I've then slowed way, 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 way down and put through a ton of reverb. And in a sense, if you squint at it and close your eyes and just listen, it almost sounds like kind of like a bird. So hence, bird sample. But it's actually a Fairlight sample that I've just doctored a whole bunch. Underneath that, comp effects means computer effects. It's computer effects. That's just me doing a whole bunch of FM shenanigans. Basically, if you're doing FM synthesis and you set all of your frequencies for your operators ridiculously high, at least in the digital domain, you start getting aliasing. And this is me purposely causing that aliasing and sort of tuning the pitch of the operators to get all of that weird errors and, again, aliasing to change. And aliasing changes really fast with really small changes to the input source. I've just recorded that, sent it through the Thunder delay. Again, we'll get to that. And you get that sort of sound. Underneath that, low effects, very descriptive, thanks past me, but it sounds like this. Nice and crunchy. I like it. It kind of sounds like you're dragging like rocks across the floor. It has that kind of a vibe to it. And that is a Silent Hill 2 sample originally. It's actually a sound taken from that soundtrack that I've reversed and pitched down and put through effects. It's this. Anyone who's played it will recognize that sound. Anyway, underneath that, Foley sample. Again, very descriptive. What are we hearing? So that is also actually a series of Fairlight samples. And the reason I know that is because you hear that like tone in that sort of upper mid and highs. Basically, because the Fairlight is such an old digital sampler, the actual audio quality of the sounds coming off of it isn't very good. And if you pitch them way, 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 way down, all the little whines and tones and weirdness that are way up in the top end that normally you'd kind of just be able to ignore come well into the audio range, and you can hear it quite obviously. Oh yeah, and on this EQ, you can tell I even tried to cut it. So this is what it sounds like cut. And soloed, preferably. The tone is loud enough that even with a 16 dB cut right on it, it's still there. But I think I just opted to leave it out because it added to the vibe. And for all these songs, technically, a lot of things might not sound great, but if it contributes to the vibe, then I just leave it. After that, it's just distortion and an EQ. Nothing special. Underneath that, we have the cricket samples, which, does it sound like crickets? It does kind of sound like crickets, but I know that's not crickets. That is a sample of a bunch of people talking, and if you loop a sample and then you play it up really, really high on the keyboard, that loop just goes through super quick, and you get that sort of chirping, repeating kind of effect, as follows. So yeah, that is that sound. You'll start to see as we get deeper into this, there's a whole lot of just sampling trickery going on. It's most of the sounds in a lot of these songs come from some kind of a sample source rather than being actually synthesized. Okay, so everything Cricket samples up was all created, designed, arranged, whatnot in FL Studio before it all got rendered and dumped into Pro Tools for editing and mixing. But these junk tracks, these are recorded right here in Pro Tools, and they are exactly what you would imagine they are. It's me bringing in a bunch of junk into the studio and hitting it with things, and then sequencing out those recordings. So junk left is this. Ooh, something fun in there. Okay, so that sound, I know by the tone of it, that was a stepladder that I brought down and was scraping and hitting with a pair of drumsticks. And you can hear there's a little bit of crunch there, and then there's also an interesting reverse delay. To get a reverse delay, basically all you do is you put a delay on something. So let's just say we did a mod delay. Why not? You set your delay time to whatever you want, and that's cool. But then after that, I would add, where are you? A reverser. And I'd add that after the delay. So all of those echoes go into the reverser and then come back at you reversed. And it gives you that really interesting reversed echo sound. And on here, I also see I have a bit crusher. And this becomes very, very, very important. Remember how earlier, as I said, the Fairlight sampler, because it is so old, doesn't have the best audio quality for its samples. Well, I like the vibe of a slightly crunchy sample that isn't pristinely high quality. So in order to get that kind of sound, if I'm not doing any kind of crazy repitching sort of jazz, I'll use a bit crusher. In this case, I set it to 22.1 and 12-bit because I'm trying to emulate the sound of the EPS Classic, which was a 12-bit sampler that had a variety of different sample rates that you could choose from. One of them being 22.1. So what that basically does, it does what you'd expect a bit crusher to do. It makes the top end all crunchy. You get all the weird artifacts up there in the top as well, and it makes the whole thing a little duller, you could say. But it adds such a neat vibe. This is the junk track without it. And then with. You can hear the character of the high end is changed. It's not super obvious. It's still clear. You can hear what the sound is, but it's just got this little bit of extra grit on the top end, which I like. Junk right was the same process, but different things being hit. So it sounds like this. That was a metal guitar stand that I was just knocking around with a hammer. And plus all those live recorded things, I also just flew in some samples. So we have an electric garage door, rattling metal doors that all kind of come together to make these wild kind of sounds. Basically, all these junk tracks are doing is it's taking, let's face it, what is a fairly monotonous arrangement of things that just drone on, and just adding little bits of sound here and there to make it feel more alive and just give it a little bit of motion and a bit of life. All that's being sent into the junk aux, which let me guess, oh, there's a reverser. So in this case, I have it set up so every 10/16 notes, according to whatever tempo the session's set at, which is irrelevant, it's set to 120, the Pro Tools default, but this song really doesn't have a tempo, so to say. So this is kind of just arbitrary. But I have that reverser going on, an EQ, a limiter just to keep things in control, and that's about it. So then we get to the vocal track, which sounds like this.
Or a stranger taken over tempering controls with numbed senses. Hours at a time pass over.
It's a very dramatic reading voice. For being a vocal, it's not anything like a traditional vocal. It's not sung, it's not in rhythm, it's not even really in a pitch, so to say. It's really just a really dramatic reading of lyrics. And the processing of that, there's a gate, which is entirely to keep the background noise from my workspace at least a little bit suppressed. Because remember, my computer and my monitoring system, it's all in the same room, so there is just inherently background noise. This is taking care of a little bit of that, particularly since we're going into compression after. But that's just doing standard vocal compression kind of stuff. The really interesting thing is this. Welcome to Snap Heap, one of my favorite things, especially in Pro Tools land, because you can have really complicated effects change on a single insert. It's like Patcher in FL, for those who are more familiar there. And you can run things in parallel, in series, and you can stack up effects to just your heart's content. It's amazing. So this is the vocal effects chain. So I'm doing a lot of filtering, a whole ton of distortion. Pitch shifting, especially on vocals, becomes a big deal in order to get that like really otherworldly alien kind of sounds. More bit crushing, a phaser for some movement, and then delays, because delay is cool and makes things long and atmospheric and fun. There's a double of that vocal underneath it, which is down, I want to say, is it down an octave? It's down a little more than an octave, and it sounds like, well, it sounds like this on its own. Not really that great, but with the vocal, it adds that extra octave underneath, and it just gives it some weight and some oomph. Very cool. So that's really all the audio. That's all the parts. It's really not a ton going on. Under that, we just have all of the auxes. So simple V, simple reverb. It's a deverb and an EQ. And this is even named general reverb. Or it's the reverb I send things to when I know I want reverb on it, but I don't know what kind of sound I'm going for. I don't know if I want it something more fancy or something more basic. So I just say, screw it, send it to the general, and it works. Under that, the cavern reverb, which, I mean, it's also named cavern reverb. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's got all the pre-processing to make the input signal a bit smoother. We have space, where we're using a Bricasti IR to give it a nice, big, washy ambient sound, hence using the ambiances IRs. Then you throw that through a deverb to get even more wash, and then a limiter just to keep things in check, and a final EQ to get rid of any buildup, because there is a lot of buildup. These vocals are very mid-heavy. There's not a whole lot of high notes, so all that reverb gets pretty a lot. And under that, my pride and joy of this particular session, the thunder delay. So it's a delay chain. So EQ, compression, nothing crazy there. And then there's a mod delay. So this is stereo. So the left side is set to a dotted quarter. Right side is set to a half note. 40% feedback on each, about 7.5K low pass filters. And that already would sound fine, but it's regular. Because they're actually set to note intervals, it's a regular repeat. But if you set another delay after it, also ping-ponging and at a totally random millisecond amount, you end up getting this almost rolling thunder kind of effect whenever you put something through it, which is much, much cooler than just a regularly repeating delay. And then a deverb because washiness is cool. That's about it. It all gets pumped through a submaster, an EQ with a big old sub boost. Holy. That's probably to try and get these heartbeats to really go boom. And then limiter, just to make things louder, but obviously not clip it. Monitoring. And that's about that. At the bottom here, this is actually something I'm quite happy about. I don't use VCAs very often. I've tried using them in other contexts, and I've never gotten the hang of it. It's never worked for me. But this is one case, and it's one case with every single song I realized, where I found a use for it. And you can see I have the group set up over here. All no Vox. Or essentially, this VCA, when I'm drawing in all these automation lines, is set up so that it takes every single audio source in the song, except the vocal, and will just turn it up and down based on this, which is really good. Let's say I want to highlight a particular word, or if there's a vocal section where I don't want to actually turn the vocal track up, but I just want something to have a bit more space, well, then I just use the VCA and turn literally everything else down in one fell swoop. And it's kind of great. It's a good way of... I find it's a good way of working. It works for me. And yeah, That's kind of the whole thing. Again, as I said at the start, it's really straightforward. There's not a ton going on, especially in comparison to all the things they're going to look at in the future. So, yeah.
And that's a wrap. All right, thank you for watching. Next time, we're going to be going over Track 2, Terminal. I hope to see you then. And once again, thank you so much for watching. Cheers.